Hamas searches for hostages' bodies with help from the Red Cross and an Egyptian team. The delivery of all the bodies of Israeli hostages is part of the agreement between Hamas and Israel brokered by Trump. The current difficulty lies in removing the bodies buried beneath collapsed buildings. The announcement about the intensified search for the remaining hostage bodies came from Tel Aviv. The Israeli government says the search in the Gaza Strip is being carried out by the Red Cross and Hamas, with the assistance of an Egyptian team. According to Tel Aviv, the Red Cross, a Hamas representative, and an Egyptian team are searching for the remains of hostages held in the Gaza Strip since the October 7, 2023 attack. The search teams, equipped with construction machinery, have been authorized by Israeli authorities to move beyond the yellow line, under the close supervision of the Israeli army, to identify the location of our hostages, declared government spokesperson Shosh Bedrosian. A Red Cross source has already confirmed the organization's participation in the search. Images from France Press in the Al-Tufa neighborhood in Gaza City show construction machinery and trucks among the rubble trying to recover bodies. It is difficult to locate some of the bodies of Israeli hostages because the occupation has changed Gaza's terrain. Furthermore, some of the people who buried these hostages were themselves killed or no longer remember where they buried them, argued Hamas's chief negotiator Khalil al-Hayya last Saturday. Khalil al-Hayya assured that the Palestinian movement intends to return the bodies of the Israeli hostages despite the difficulties the operation entails. "We will not give the occupation, Israel, an excuse to resume the war," the Palestinian negotiator added. Families of the hostages demand the delivery of all bodies still in Gaza, recalling that progress in the peace plan depended on this delivery by October 13th, a deadline long past. The Forum of Hostage Families called for the suspension of the next stages of the ceasefire agreement if Hamas does not expedite the return of the 13 remaining bodies still held in Palestinian territory. In a statement, the families' organization urged the Israeli government, the U.S. administration, and the mediators not to move to the next phase of the agreement until Hamas fulfills all its obligations. The second phase includes the disarmament of Hamas, amnesty or exile for its fighters, and the continued withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Gaza Strip. U.S. downplays bombings in Gaza and says Israeli attacks do not violate ceasefire. The ceasefire agreement remains theoretically in effect. Still, early Monday morning, an Israeli drone attack was reported in the Abbasan al-Kabira area, east of Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. One Palestinian was killed, and at least 6 others were injured in the strike, which the U.S. Secretary of State did not consider a violation of the truce, claiming that Israel targeted a member of Islamic Jihad. Abbasan al-Kabira lies within the so-called Yellow Line, the demarcation up to which the Israeli army withdrew in Gaza when the agreement took effect. The truce covers the entire Gaza Strip and requires Israeli troops to pull back to the Yellow Line. However, this does not mean that civilians cannot access the area or that the ceasefire does not apply there, even though Israel has invoked self-defense and threats to its troops to justify shooting at Palestinians in that zone. Israel justified the attack as targeting a member of Islamic Jihad, an ally of Hamas in Gaza, accused of planning attacks against Israeli forces. Speaking aboard Air Force One during Donald Trump's trip to Asia, Marco Rubio said the U.S. does not view this strike as a violation of the ceasefire. The U.S. Secretary of State added that Israel has not relinquished its right to self-defense under the agreement mediated by Washington, Egypt, and Qatar, which allowed Hamas to release the hostages held in Gaza. They have the right if there is an imminent threat to Israel, and all mediators agree with that, Rubio told reporters, justifying the U.S. stance. He added that Hamas must accelerate the return of the bodies of hostages who died in captivity. More than 93 residents of Gaza have been killed in the Strip due to Israeli attacks between October 11th, the day the ceasefire came into force, and Sunday, according to the enclave's health ministry. At least 43 died in shootings and air raids by Israeli troops, often for crossing the Yellow Line. The remaining 45 or so were killed last Sunday, when Israel resumed bombings across Gaza for one day in retaliation for a skirmish between its troops and suspected Hamas militants in Rafah, south. Zelensky appeals. Ukraine needs financial support for another 2 or 3 years to defend against Russia. Volodymyr Zelensky's pleas for help are not new, but this time the Ukrainian president was more specific about the time frame during which his country will need financial aid. The leader reiterated his appeals to the European Union, stressing that Kyiv requires funding for another 2 or 3 years to withstand the Russian invasion, and renewed his call for the United States to pressure China to reduce its support for Moscow. Speaking about a European Commission proposal to gradually use frozen Russian assets to finance Ukraine's war effort, Zelensky emphasized that the war, and the need for aid, would be longer lasting. I reinforced this point to all European leaders. I told them we will not fight for decades, but they must show that, for a certain period, they can provide stable financial support to Ukraine, Zelensky declared at a press conference on Tuesday. That's why they have this proposal in mind. 2 or 3 years. The war could end earlier, but money will be needed for reconstruction, he added. According to Zelensky, Kyiv needs stable and long-term support because we don't know if Putin will resume aggression after the war ends. Last week, the Ukrainian president acknowledged that unlocking frozen Russian assets by the EU is crucial for Ukraine and expressed confidence in a political decision by the end of the year. The decision on frozen Russian assets is crucial for us, Zelensky said at the time. The European Commission proposed mobilizing frozen Russian assets held by Europeans since the start of the invasion to continue funding Kyiv as a reparations loan that could reach $140 billion. However, discussions at last Thursday's European Council ended in deadlock due to guarantees demanded by Belgium, the EU member state where most Russian assets are held, which does not want to bear all the legal and financial risks involved. Zelensky hopes Trump will pressure Xi Jinping. In the same press conference released this morning, Zelensky admitted he hopes the U.S. president will pressure China's leader this week, during Donald Trump's official trip to Asia, to reduce Beijing's support for Moscow, particularly regarding Chinese imports of Russian hydrocarbons. This could be one of Trump's strong gestures, especially if, after decisive sanctions, China is ready to reduce its imports from Russia, Zelensky said, referring to sanctions imposed last week by Washington on 2 major Russian oil companies. Donald Trump and Xi Jinping are expected to meet Thursday in South Korea on the sidelines of the APEC, Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Last week, the United States announced sanctions against 2 Russian oil giants. Trump also urged buyers of Russian hydrocarbons, particularly China and India, to reduce imports. Regarding the military situation, Zelensky said the city of Pokrovsk in eastern Ukraine is Russia's main target, with 200 Russian soldiers stationed there, a city that Russian forces have been trying to capture for several months. According to a United Nations report released Monday, Russia has committed another crime against humanity by pursuing and forcing civilians to flee territories it controls in Ukraine through continuous drone attacks. The UN's Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine also concluded that the Russian Federation committed war crimes by deporting and transferring civilians from occupied areas in the Zaporizhia region. Russian authorities systematically coordinated actions to expel Ukrainian civilians from their homes through drone attacks and by carrying out expulsions and transfers, the report stated. Trump says Putin should end the war in Ukraine instead of testing missiles. U.S. President Donald Trump said that Russian President Vladimir Putin should end the war in Ukraine instead of testing a nuclear missile, adding that the U.S. has a nuclear submarine stationed off the Russian coast. The Russian president should end the war in Ukraine, said Trump, calling it inappropriate for Putin to announce the test. This war, which should have lasted a week, will soon enter its 4th year. That's what he should be doing instead of testing missiles, Trump told reporters aboard his plane en route to Japan during his Asian tour. Putin announced on Sunday that Russia had successfully tested its Burevestnik nuclear cruise missile, a nuclear-capable weapon Moscow claims can pierce any defense shield, and that it plans to proceed with deployment. Asked about the 9M730 Burevestnik, Stormbird in Russian, codenamed SSC-X-9 Skyfall by NATO, which Moscow says flew 14,000 kilometers, Trump replied that the U.S. didn't need to fly that far since it had a nuclear submarine off their coast. They know we have the world's largest nuclear submarine right off their coast, so, it doesn't need to travel 13,000 kilometers, Trump added. Trump has repeatedly said he wants to end the war in Ukraine, Europe's deadliest conflict since World War II, although he admitted that achieving peace there has been more difficult than reaching a ceasefire in Gaza or ending the India-Pakistan conflict. Since announcing the Burevestnik in 2018, Putin has presented it as a response to U.S. initiatives to build a missile defense shield after Washington unilaterally withdrew from the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty in 2001 and to NATO's expansion. They're not playing with us and we're not playing with them, Trump stressed. We test missiles all the time. According to Reuters, on October 25th, the Trump administration prepared additional sanctions that could target key sectors of the Russian economy if Putin continues to delay ending Moscow's war in Ukraine. Asked at the time whether he was considering further sanctions against Russia, Trump said, "You'll find out." Russia guided by its own interests. Reacting to Trump's comments, the Kremlin said Russia is guided by its own national interests and sees no reason why the missile test should harm relations with the White House. Despite all our openness to dialogue with the United States, Russia and the Russian president are guided primarily by our own national interests, said Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov. It was so, it is so, and it will remain so. The Kremlin stated that Russia is ensuring its own security by developing new weapons. There is nothing here that could or should harm relations between Moscow and Washington, Peskov said.